There are so many tutorials on how to simulate explosions in Blender and how to import simulations from other programs into Blender, but nobody is talking about the right way to set up materials for those explosions. So in this video, I'm going to show you the best tool available for creating explosion materials for Cycles and Eevee inside of Blender. Now the product we're looking at today is the Pyro Shader from Fraser Effects. I wanted to create the best explosion material available. I wanted to compete with other materials to create one that not only gives you lots of customization, but tons of power. You can buy this shader from the link in the description or from this little tag up in the corner of the screen here. When you get it, you also have the option to get it with 3 pre-simulated explosions that you can just import into Blender. And this is how you would import those explosions once you buy them. So inside of Blender, we're going to hit Shift A, and we're going to go down to Volume and click Import OpenVDB. Now I'm just going to take one of these explosions and copy the file path up here and hit Enter, and you'll see that we've got this huge selection of files, and each one of these is essentially one frame of the simulation. So if we hit A and click Import OpenVDB Volume, now if we scrub through the timeline, we can see our explosion playing out. Now I want this in the middle of our scene, so I'm going to scale it down and bring it up, and I'll hit number pad period to center to the explosion. And now when we pop into render view, we should see basically a bunch of smoke because it's a volume, but it doesn't know what to do with all of the data that it has. Now in order to use the Pyro Shader, we're going to take our view here and split it in 2 and change this to the shader editor. And I'll hit N to collapse this panel. And we're going to create a new material, which we can just call FFX Pyro. Now we'll take our default principled volume and we'll actually delete that. And what you're going to do is you're going to go to wherever you have downloaded your shader, and we're just going to take that file from your Explorer and we're just going to drag it into the window, release, and we can click append, and we're going to go to the node tree folder and double click FFX Pyro. Now if we hit Shift A in the shader editor, under group, we will find FFX Pyro, and we can drag that into the volume, not the surface. And now you can see that we've got shading for our explosion. It's super, super bright. And that's because it's actually using values that would look good in a physically accurate space. So we could actually bring down the brightness if we wanted to. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take our HDRI in the surface. We can take the strength here and set it to 20. And then in our exposure under color management, we'll just take this and bring it down till the exposure looks correct. Because explosions are really, really bright, and so is the sun. So if we bring everything really bright and then bring our exposure down, this is more or less working in physically accurate values. And as you can see, as we scrub through our timeline here, we can see this explosion already has all of our fire and smoke elements set up and ready to go. You can pretty much drag and drop this onto any explosion and you're just ready to render. But let's talk about these different settings here. So the first setting that we have is a slider, and it's called Use Blackbody. What this setting is going to do is it's going to determine whether or not we're using a physically correct temperature scale for our color. If we have this turned all the way down, it'll just use this fire color attribute. So if we wanted, say, a purple flame, we could just adjust that within our fire color parameter and make sure that Use Blackbody is turned all the way down. And now we have a purple explosion. Just like that. It's just that easy. But if you want to use physically correct blackbody values, then we keep this turned up and we mess with these 2 temperature values. Because I didn't want to just set one temperature for the entire flame. It used to be that way in the shader, but that was inflexible. Because real life explosions, they have variation to the color temperature. So the really bright, really hot spots of the explosion take on a more yellow color, while the dimmer, less temperate parts of the fire take on more of an orangish red color. But we can change these values. If we wanted an overall warmer explosion, maybe we could take the temperature minimum and bring that down to 1000, maybe like 1200. And we could take the temperature max and bring that down to 2500. Now these temperature values are really useful for getting a more specific look while still in the physically correct range, so you don't have to just like eyeball pick one. If you wanted, for example, to be able to hand pick colors for the brighter and darker parts, here's something that we can do. So we can come under to the OpenVDB properties here, the object properties, and we can see that we have 2 properties here that are being used. We have density, which is the density of the smoke, and we have flames, which is the intensity of the fire. So if in our shader editor we add an attribute node, we can actually directly reference one of these. For example, if we type in flames, then this attribute now, this factor, is actually going to represent the intensity of the flames. Maybe we feed this into a color ramp and we can adjust the two colors to whatever we want. Maybe we increase this contrast a little bit. And now you can see the super bright hot spots of the flame have turned blue, and the darker parts that are less intense have turned red. Now, flames with an S at the end isn't actually the default value for Blender. If you create your simulation inside of Blender, it will only be flame. But since we have this OpenVDB here, and we know that the attribute is called flames, we know to change this to flames so that we see the correct result in the viewport. But maybe we quite like our purple fire here. So the next value that we would have is brightness. The brightness is pretty self-explanatory. This is just the intensity scale of our fire. Next, we have this really cool value here called translucency. And when you turn that up, what you're gonna see is that the outside of the flame becomes way more intense, but we almost get this hollow appearance where the inside of the fire isn't intense at all. It gives it this cool kind of Fresnel effect, but for this 3D volume. This can be really helpful if you're doing like a fireball effect or some flames and you want to add a little bit more depth and complexity to it. Sometimes turning up the translucency is all you need. That actually does a really good job of emulating kind of what like a fireball or really complex flames look like sometimes, but not all of the case. In the case of an explosion, I will keep the translucency down to 0 because you get more of a volumetric lighting from your explosion. Now, these last two settings here are use custom flames and this flames attribute. So maybe you have a different attribute that you want to be able to use, because by default, the Pyro Shader already supports the flame attribute and the flames attribute, but maybe your explosion uses a different attribute name, or maybe you wanted to use, say, density. So what we can do is we can turn up this use custom flames slider, and this is going to transition out the normal flames, and instead is going to use whatever we plug into here. So let's create a new instance of that attribute node from earlier. What we can do is we can type in the name of maybe the density attribute and plug that into the factor. We could also add in some math nodes in between here. So here we're getting a totally different experience to using the flames attribute. Maybe we want to use sort of a mix of the two, and that kind of fills up the explosion with more flame. Or maybe you want to use this feature because you want to use an attribute like temperature. Sometimes if you export an explosion from something like Houdini or Embergen, or even an explosion simulated inside of Blender, sometimes the temperature attribute is actually going to give you a better result. But for now, we want to stay with the normal flames attribute for these simulations. Now we're into the next section of the node, and you can see it's a little bit smaller, but we're talking about smoke settings. Just as important as your flames arguably is your smoke. Maybe we can turn up use custom flames, because I know that'll get rid of our regular fire, and we can play with just the smoke for a minute here. So we've got a couple of basic settings. The first one obviously is smoke color, but I'll let you in on an interesting little tip you can play with. I found that sometimes an interesting way to go is maybe you take the black body node and you plug that into there. And we want to make this sort of a slightly bluish color like 7500, but this can give your smoke a bit of a bright milky quality to it, which I don't know, sometimes it works really well for fire effects. It's not always the case, but you know, it's worth playing around with. The second setting is density multiplier. Now this is obviously just the multiplier for the density. Turning this up will give you way denser smoke, and turning it down will give you less dense smoke, hence density multiplier. Then we got this use custom density because for the same reason, I wanted to give you the option to use whatever density attribute your particular simulation used. Maybe you export it from a program where it's actually called smoke instead of density, or in case you want to modify it or subtract something from your density, whatever you want to do. Now we've got this pretty cool looking explosion, but it's pretty chunky. It's a pretty low resolution explosion. So how do we make the most of that? Well, if you've been paying attention to the left side of my screen, you've noticed a whole chunk of settings here called noise settings. So I have built into the shader this really cool feature that lets you use procedural noise textures to essentially upscale the smoke. So if we just turn up these values here, the smoke noise and the flames noise, you can see that instantly a lot more detail is brought into our explosion. Let's turn on the translucency a bit and we can see it better. We've got so many more fine details, and it looks more like a very high resolution, sharp smoke than it does some kind of a thick simulation. So for example, if we turn these values back down, you can see everything looks very smooth and glossed over, and you can almost see the voxels here. I mean, you kind of can see the voxels in the simulation. You can see some of the stepping, but when we turn up the noise parameters, instantly it's got far more dense detail, almost like clouds or, you know, actual smoke. We can also maybe just bring down the intensity of the noise a little bit, so we still get some of the fullness of our original explosion, because adding in the noise tends to add in a lot of contrast, but this way we still retain some of that general volumetric smokiness. I just realized this kind of looks like a nebula. It looks really cool. It looks like something you would see in outer space. It looks like a space scene. And basically, in a matter of like, 30 seconds, you're able to go from a fresh OpenVDB file or an explosion simulation to a fully materialized explosion, and it looks really, really, really freaking cool. So head down to the description right now so that you can pick this awesome tool up for yourself and instantly start making better explosions.